ladies and gentlemen, to the Matt Hatter Show. What's Kamala Harris's favorite game? Hide and seek, especially when it comes to taking clear positions. So it turns out that Kamala Harris isn't actually using a teleprompter. And all this time I thought she was at her events. Instead, she decided long ago to start using a mirror when talking to the crowd. Evidently, this was to remind her of who she's truly representing, because it sure isn't the voters. If elected, Harris would immediately become the world's best magician. She'll make all of those campaign promises disappear in a flash. We all know that Trump has Trump Force One, and the president gets to fly on Air Force One. But did you know that Kamala Harris's campaign team has a nickname for her transport vehicle too? It's called the Double Standard, which she's always riding when it suits her. Anyone who has ever watched her answer her questions might recall that glazed look that she gets. I think from now on we should call that the Kamala stare instead of the deer in the headlights look, because it perfectly captures the moment when you realize you've lost your way, but you still have to keep talking. Do you know why Kamala Harris never gets lost? Because after 10 minutes of talking in circles, she always ends up right back where she started. And just like Joe Biden climbing stairs, she never gets anywhere. If she loses the election next week, she could always get a job as a tour guide, since she is great at taking people in circles and ending right back up where she started. And if that doesn't work out, she could become a professional juggler, since she is so skilled at juggling issues without ever committing to one. And there's always a possible career as a weather reporter, a job perfect for someone who can talk about storms brewing without ever having to predict where they'll land. A toy maker has recently announced a new twist on the Magic 8 Ball. Only it's called the Kamala Cube. You can ask it any question you'd like. However, all the answers begin with, and let me be clear, before enveloping you in a foggy mist, leaving you dazed, confused, looking for the exit, just like the attendees at her rallies. And speaking of toys, Kamala announced at a campaign event recently that she started selling a new board game. It's called the Kamala Ain't Got a Clue. You can challenge your friends to see who can avoid answering questions the longest. The twist? Every time you dodge a question, you collect Kamala points. But don't worry, those points are just as vague as her answers. And remember this, folks, the winner gets a special prize. You guessed it, a fog machine. So we will start today's roundup in the news cycle with what's going on in the polling for Trump versus Harris in the election, which of course ends, I would love to say it takes place next week on Tuesday. Like I said in my last video, we really have reached the point where we have an entire season now dedicated to elections, because again, we can't seem to do it in one day. So right now, the polling averages have Trump leading in the national polls by 0.3 of a point. Basically, it is a statistical tie. Of course, there are a lot of polls which tell different stories. We will dive into those just a little bit. So going over to the national Trump versus Harris polls, we can look back over the last couple of weeks. We have our tally, 1, 2, 3, we have about 6 polls which show Trump with a lead, and we have 5 polls which show Harris with a lead, and 3 which reflect a tie. Now, if we look into the last week or so of polling, we have the TIPP poll of about 1,250 likely voters. Decent margin of error, shows Trump ahead by 1. The Atlas Intel poll, which is a national poll here in this case, 3,490 likely voters, has Trump ahead by 2. The Forbes Harris X poll, 3,718 likely voters, decent margin of error, has Harris ahead by 2. Rasmussen, pretty good poll here, 2,397 likely voters, Trump ahead by 2. And the Morning Consult poll, the largest sample size, decent margin of error, shows Harris ahead by 3. So, averaging the polls together over the last few weeks, we can see that Trump edges out Harris in the average by just 0.3 of a point. Again, statistically, a tie. If we turn the page over to the Rasmussen reports, one of the more recent polls, we can see here that in the latest Rasmussen National Telephone and Online Survey, that Trump edges out Harris by 2% points, 48 to 46, which is actually a 1-point loss for Harris from the previous survey, which had Harris at 47 and Trump at 48. And this kind of reaffirms what I have said before. I don't think that Trump's biggest surge has so much been where just people are breaking heavily for Trump necessarily, but that people are really beginning to have second thoughts about Harris. Now, what that ultimately translates to whenever it comes time to push that button for election is anyone's guess. I would estimate, I would begin to say here, or think to say that most likely what it will end up doing is decreasing the likelihood of voter turnout for Harris. And that's kind of what we are seeing, at least in terms of early voting numbers, where Republicans are outpacing Democrats, which typically Democrats have always built up, or I should say in the last few election cycles, have built up a large number of early votes, which essentially creates this large swell anyways of support for their candidate, and that does not appear to be materializing for Harris, at least. Now, there are some conflicting reports. There are different pundits who are weighing in on this, and some are saying, hey, don't worry about it. We'll get them on election day. But that has traditionally been more of a Republican talking point. The interesting thing is that I was actually watching some of the Rasmussen analytics earlier, and the pollster for Rasmussen was making the point that a lot of the early votes right now have favored Trump over Harris, or at least by political affiliation, we'll say. But then when you look at the detailed breakdown, that there were still 51% of the voting electorate that were going to cast their votes, and it was Republican electorate that were cast their votes on election day, which essentially is outpacing Democrats, by about 5 percentage points. So if that holds true, then not only is Trump potentially leaning in the early vote, but then you will also see a large surge of Republicans showing up at the polls on election day too. And if that is indeed the case, then it bodes very poorly for Harris. Again, I don't want to, start celebrating right now. There's no reason to do that. Yeah, Trump is leading in the polls. That's great. That's really good news. However, that is no reason to get complacent and think Trump's got this thing in the bag. He doesn't. There are always potential for, shenanigans. There are always potential for things happening. There is always a potential of weather events and all sorts of things taking place, or emergencies. So this race is still, for all intents and purposes, a toss-up. Now I'm hearing a number of people saying, hey, it's just, it's only a toss-up because Democrats are not willing to admit defeat. I don't believe that we should, adopt that position. No matter how things ultimately shape out, this election is still going to be relatively close. Now, may not end up being close by modern standards, I guess, but in terms of historical standards, it is still going to end up being pretty close. If we look at the polling data on a state-by-state basis, and I'm filtering this exclusively for the Atlas Intel, the only reason that I have chosen to do that, there's two reasons. Number one, they were very accurate in the last elections, which is a good reason to use them, obviously. Number two, they're doing really well with their sample sizes. I'm not a big fan of these 300, 400, 600 sample size polls. Yeah, I know that's typical, unfortunately, and there are arguments to be made for it. But when you're looking at tight races, if you have a very small sample size, measured in the hundreds, 5, 6, 700 people, if only one out of every 100 is inconsistent in what they are telling you, that has the potential for, of course, swaying the poll very, 1, 2, 3 points, whatever, in any given direction. So, example, if you've got the typical phenomenon which we've seen in the past, last two elections, what I would say the closet Trump voters, those who will not admit publicly to supporting Trump, but whenever it comes time to actually go into the voting booth, they are very much pro-Trump. Maybe they live in a predominantly Democratic household, or they just don't really care whenever it comes to these polls. They're undecided. Again, lots of reasons. So I do prefer larger sample size over smaller sample size. In my opinion, 1,000 or more is better than, again, these smaller polls. Now, that doesn't mean that just because you have a large sample size that you're guaranteed to get a more accurate poll. If your sample size is not in some way reflective of the composition, the actual makeup for that particular state, in terms of demographics and voting blocks, those types of things, then you're going to end up, of course, creating outlier polls. So if we look here, this is the Arizona 2024 multi-candidate, the multi-candidate poll. This is looking at Trump, Harris, Stein, Oliver, Kennedy, West, etc. Right now, Atlas Intel, if we go back about a month, they had Trump winning this by about 1 point in Arizona. Now, I'm not so much interested necessarily in the point spread on this between Trump and Harris as much as I am in terms of momentum and in terms of perhaps direction. I don't think the polls necessarily are the best way of being able to accurately 100% predict how things are going to ultimately end up, but they are good about being able to tell you direction. And if you look here, September 25th, almost 1,000 likely voters in the sample size. Again, it's a little bit less than 1,000, but it's close enough. Trump had a 1 point edge at that point, went to a tie. Again, not much movement, a little bit larger sample size. That's what I said earlier. Having these larger sample sizes, really important. Stein getting a point, none for any other candidates. At this point, though, we've actually seen Trump begin to have a little bit more of a spread in terms of the vote tally. So you can see a little bit of a shift here. 1 point, a tie. People trying to make up that decision on who they're going to vote for, and then they just kind of started breaking in Trump's direction. Largely, though, driven by people not supporting Harris, people actually falling away from supporting Harris. And this has been my point before. It's not that people are the undecideds are just groundswell, just growing and just coming to Trump's aid necessarily, because Trump didn't move very much. He was at 50% here, basically the same thing here, and he's at 51 here. Not much movement. It's where people are leaving Harris. All right, they've seen through the facade. They have seen through the illusion that the media has tried its best to create for the last 3 months to prop up Harris, and people, at least in Arizona, have recognized that it ain't working. Now, if we were only talking about one state where this were an issue, just Arizona, that might be an anomaly, right? The problem is that the same type of a pattern is being demonstrated in other states too. Nevada is a good example. Okay, 2024, Nevada multi-candidate, same thing. Also filtering for Atlas, again, larger sample sizes. I would like for these two to be a little bit larger, but hey, they're close enough to my 1,000 likely voter sample that I do prefer as a state poll. Atlas Intel, and again, this is not so much showing you necessarily how things will end up happening or breaking, but this does show a shift or a change in the weather pattern. September 25th, Harris was leading by 3 points. 48% people going for Trump and 51 for Harris. Now, look what happened. Mid-October, it went to a tie. Why? Because people started to abandon Harris. She dropped 3 points between here and here. Trump did not move in the poll. All right? Trump didn't move. Harris did. People began to abandon her in early to mid-October. Atlas Intel, again, this one a little bit closer, 1,083 likely voters, reflects the same thing, a tie, again. Now, people still are undecided. There are still some undecideds in this sample. Because when you add this together, you're still at 96% for this poll and 98% for this poll, with 2% either in the undecided or 4% in the undecided. Stein went from 2 here to none here. Could happen. Again, people trying to make up their minds. But what's interesting here is in this most recent poll, now I wish it were a little bit larger, but again, the most recent poll, Trump actually picked up some momentum. So it's like the Harris campaign stalled, and then the Trump campaign began to rise. Now that's interesting. Now she only dropped by 1 point, but this could indicate, this is a good poll for Trump, maybe too good to be true, we'll be real. This could indicate, though, that Trump is actually beginning to surge in Nevada at this point. That's actually very good for him. And we also know that going into this election, Democrats, of course, were thinking that they were going to have the best turnout in the early vote, and that has not yet materialized in Nevada. If we turn our attention over to Wisconsin, polling data, again, looking at just Atlas Intel over the course of the last 4 polls that they have produced. Atlas Intel, September the 25th, 1,077 likely voters, Trump ahead by 2. Atlas Intel, this is on 10/17, 932 likely voters, Harris ahead by 1. It looks like there was a little bit, there are potentially some spoilers occurring here, maybe with Kennedy, Oliver, Stein. This is a very tight race. So any of this can affect any of this right here. But what was interesting is that back-to-back polls from Atlas. Now, this one here I do really like because it's a much larger poll. As I said earlier, 1 or 2, people out of 100 saying I'm voting for candidate 1 instead of candidate 2, and then they go into the polling booth and they're lying intentionally, they're being deceptive or whatever, or they are on the fence. They've got that decision to make, and it's 50-50 in their mind. And you ask them on Monday who they're voting for, and they say I'm voting for Harris. And you ask them on Tuesday, now I'm voting for Trump. Who are they really voting for? They probably don't actually know. So if you have it with just 1 out of every 100 doing that, when you deal with these tight races, which can happen, it's going to sway the outcome. Now, some would argue, well, it could happen both ways, and that is true. It could, but the question that I often raise is, who is it more difficult for somebody to acknowledge that they are voting for? Right now, the pressure from the media, from celebrities, is to vote for Harris. Overwhelmingly, there's no doubt about it. She's getting hundreds of hours worth of free ad time on many of these major networks, largely because they're bashing her rival, her opponent, Donald Trump, and they are playing her up. So you listen to the way that they talk, even the use of the adjectives and things. Hey, Trump was in Wisconsin, and he did this campaign event, very neutral. Okay, Trump in let's say in Wisconsin again, pulling this stunt with this garbage truck. That's a different way of phrasing, basically the same type of an event. One way you're kind of being more objective, the other one more subjective in how you are covering it. So little things like that, those biases are overwhelming in terms of their opposition to Trump and their support of Harris. So which group, which area here, which section of the electorate do you think has the pressure to conceal their vote, Harris or Trump? I would say that most likely people are going to be more closeted about voting for Trump than for Harris. Could be wrong. Now, don't be wrong. There are unapologetic voters on both sides. I'm not talking about the people who again are just diehard supporters of either candidate. I'm talking about the independents in the middle, maybe those on the edge on between independent and being Republican, and likewise some of those who are on the opposite edge too, which we often forget about, which are those Democrats who basically are more independent leaning Democrats, some of those Reagan era Democrats and such. So in this latest poll, two back-to-back polls show Trump ahead by one. Now, in this most recent poll, much smaller than what I really prefer. I do like this one better. Again, I do like these larger sample sizes. Can be harder to do, I realize that, and of course some people would make lots of arguments as to why those are unnecessary, but that's just my personal preference. Now, we could look at other pollsters, look at some of the other ones here coming out. There was a Marquette poll here showing Harris ahead by 2. There was a couple polls again showing ties. USA Today poll recently showing Trump ahead by 1. And if we look back, and this is the interesting, if you really look back again at all of the polls that have been conducted, these four-way polls, going all the way back to, let's just say, late September, you can see the trend going from blue, tie, where her campaign really begins to stall, maybe still trying to keep that momentum alive, and then basically starts to collapse. Now, these are looking at the four-way races, which I think are important because whether we want to acknowledge or not, these still are four-way races at this point. Now, some people just look over at the two-way races. We can do that. So if we look over here at the two-way races, this is again still looking at Wisconsin. We've got this Marist poll released today. Decent sample size, showing Harris ahead by 2. Now, again, I don't think that we really should discount the fact that there are 4 other people on the ballot. Just because people are being forced to pick between the two, that does not necessarily mean that that's how it's going to break, and that's kind of my point. Even if we still look back over the course, the balance of these polls over the course of the last month or so, Trump ahead in 4 of these, Harris ahead in 3 of these. This poll here is really an outlier poll, and it is basically driving up a lot of this here. I mean, even though there's a 2-pointer here recent, this one here is unfairly, I think, showing a lot of support for Harris that I do not believe is there. And I've spoken about that in the past. High margin of error, low sample size, definitely not a good poll. Now this one here's got a good sample size, which is great, but again, the overall trend, I think, whenever we look at it, especially in the 4-way race, does actually indicate more of a surge and more of a lead, I think, at least towards Trump, even in Wisconsin. Granted, still no way of knowing. These are polls, and as I keep saying, polls don't win races, votes do. If we turn our attention over to Michigan, which is the other toss-up up there in the Rust Belt, we see in the 2-way race, Marist poll, again, Harris ahead by 3. Kind of what I would say maybe a bit of an outlier, truthfully. And the reason I say that is because we actually have this poll, this poll, this poll, this poll, this poll, this poll, all showing tight within a point. So again, whenever I see a poll, and I have to question this on either side, doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat, whenever I see a poll like that really just shows overwhelming support for one candidate over the other, all of the sudden, all right, out of nowhere, I got to question the poll. I really throw that out, truthfully. This one here should be thrown out. It is too small. 400 likely voters. If just one, again, 1 or 2 people per 100 said, "Hey, I'm voting for candidate X instead of candidate Y," then the whole race completely shifts in the other direction. And that's the point. You really need to go with these larger sample size polls. 800 minimum. I prefer 1,000. Truthfully, there's no magic reason for that. It's just, again, it's basically to remove some of that, I guess you say some of those uncertainty, voters, some of those individuals who say, yeah, I'm voting for candidate 1, it's candidate 2. But in reality, they're not. They're closeted one way or the other. And I would say, again, that people are typically more closeted towards, basically voting for Trump than they are voting for Harris. We've seen that before. 2020, great example. Again, it's not so much that, in this case here, the people were underestimating Biden. It's that they were underestimating Trump. They underestimated Trump's performance here by about 2 percentage points. If we have that same type of an event again, where we have a tight race again, 2 percentage points, and boom, this goes from Harris ahead by 0.8 to her behind by 1.2. And that's just mirroring what we've seen before. So to add 2 points to this, and you're right at that 50% threshold. Now it could break evenly. There's always a possibility it could be wrong. All those types of things. And that's, again, looking at just the two-way race. Looking ahead back at 2016, Trafalgar was actually the closest. There are Republican polls, nothing against that, but they were the closest in terms of being able to actually call who would win the state. The RCP average had Michigan going to Clinton by 3.6. Obviously, that was an almost 4-point swing in the direction. And if you actually look at it, which one did they get right? Well, they got Clinton right, 47%. They pegged her. 47. What'd you get? 47. Trafalgar, 47. These were overestimating it, but once you average them all together, 47. Trump, 43.4 is what they had him at, and what ended up happening? 4% boost for Trump going into Election Day, or to the final outcome rather. Again, so we see that was a little bit less in 2020. Obviously, if it had been the same, then he would have won, because this wouldn't have happened. So it was a 2-point swing for Trump, though, going into Election Day. So they knew that the race was tight. I mean, we're talking about very narrow windows, of margins here. 1, 2, 3 percentage points, in either direction can make a huge difference. Kind of my point. This race is going to be tight. I would say if you look at things right now, in 2024, go ahead and move back here, 2024. If we look at things in this direction and just take this, if we would add the 2-point surge that we've seen at the very last day, and we assume that this is actually correct, we've got Trump at 49.5, and that means that the four-way race actually has had an impact, which is a multi-candidate race, and that's kind of my point. You can't remove the multi-candidate aspect of the race, especially in areas like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, which will have an impact on this outcome to some degree. And these people are actually voting for Stein. So there's, that is important to understand, and she's basically pulling voters away from Harris. So 49% for Trump, 48, and I would suspect that if we were to actually, look at this going into the election, I would believe that. Looking at what I'm seeing over here in terms of the 2-point race, and what I'm actually seeing, look at the historicals, adding 2 points is not out of the ordinary, and that basically puts Atlas pretty well correct. Now, it still leaves a little bit of room, a little bit of wiggle room. Harris could narrowly eke out a win here. That's entirely possible. I don't want to discount that possibility at all. Point being is that it is truly close. All the indications are showing that. Looking at Pennsylvania, basically 4-way race has it as a tie. That's USA, Atlas, Fox, Atlas here, Bloomberg, Atlas here. If we actually look at these, at this point, we got 3 ties and 3 Trump wins showing in Pennsylvania, or 3 Trump, not wins, but just showing them ahead in the polls, going all the way back to about the middle of October. Now, if we go back, look at this, folks. Look at this. July, Trump was ahead. Okay, and that was, of course, Trump really, Trump versus Harris, but it was really, really early. Harris takes the lead and holds on to it. All of these polls through here show what? They all show Harris with the lead. What happens? Late September, that's whenever her campaign begins to stall a little bit. Continues, basically. Gets a little bit of a boost here in the poll. Again, most likely an outlier, I would say, based upon what we were actually beginning to see in terms of the trend line. And now Trump basically takes the lead. They don't have the little trend line down here, but that's basically what we would see if it were reflective of that. Looking at Atlas specifically, 3-3-2-2, largely basically showing Trump right around that 50 to 49% in the four-way here, somewhere in that range. He lost a little bit from here to here, but Harris really, she lost a point from here to here. And really, it's basically where people are saying, hey, maybe I'm not going to vote for Trump. I'm voting for Oliver, Stein, West, or I guess they don't have them on the ballot here, thankfully, Kennedy. In this case, I know that Kennedy's had some problems trying to get his name pulled in some of these races, in some of these states, he's tried unsuccessfully to do that. And at this point, we recognize that as we head into this last little bit of a stretch, that these these 3 or 4-way or 5-way races are going to have an impact in the actual final outcome. Also, in terms of 2-ways among the Rust Belt states, I predicted that we would ultimately see this race tighten even more, and I would say that it could even break 50-50 exact going on to election day. It's entirely possible. There will be at least 1 or 2 more polls released from some of these outfits between now and election day, because we still have 4 more days. So I fully expect it, and there are polls coming out just about every single day out of the battleground states. So USA Today is the one showing most recently a tie. Marist showing a 2-point lead for Harris. Atlas showing a 1-point lead for Trump. Insider Advantage 1-point lead for Trump. Fox 1-point lead for Trump. Quinnipiac 2-point lead for Trump. So looking at each of these polls, we know it's tight. There's no exception to that. I would actually say here again that we are looking at a situation where I do believe the momentum is still heavily favored towards Trump. I can't filter the polls on this one, but you can see that really that same event happened. Here Biden dropped out. We still had a little bit of a lead for Trump here. This is following the events of him getting shot in Pennsylvania. And then basically where everything kind of goes into a little bit of some back and forth between the two, but we see that same collapse happen, where basically people are kind of defecting from the Harris camp. I really do expect Trump to win this one. I really think he's going to. If we look at how Trump was leading prior to Biden dropping out, it was really pretty strong. And even after Biden, drops out, it was only whenever really the media began to run interference for the Harris campaign in this range that we actually began to see Harris gain any momentum at all. And that has largely stalled. As people again see her for what she is, they're seeing the lies and the distortions, the constant berating Trump, calling him Hitler and a Nazi and everything else, and then of course by virtue of that also calling his supporters that. And we haven't even touched on many of the things that are going on right now with regard to the election in general. Some of the remarks being made by some of these surrogates for the Democratic campaigns. So at this point, we have the 2-way. This is the multi-candidate race here in North Carolina. This one is Trump, Harris, Stein, Oliver, and West are all on the ballots in North Carolina. 1,373 likely voters. Trump ahead by 4. Atlas Intel had done one just the day before and had Harris ahead by 1. So if we average the 2 of these together, we have basically Trump ahead by 3. And that's what I would suggest doing on that one. This is my point. Even with these larger sample sizes, you can still have these, look at this 2 to 1. I mean, basically that 1 percentage point in here, we can see that it went from 49 to 47. Harris, a little bit of a change here going towards Trump. So these are going to have an impact, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. They will. Will they end up having an overwhelming impact? No, it's not going to be like it was in '92 with Ross Perot or anything like that. But it is going to have an impact. Atlas Intel, you can see really where, again, Harris's campaign began to stall between here and here. She lost 3 percentage points from here to here, only managed to basically kind of tread water. If you look at the combined averages of these, you would essentially say, okay, well, Harris might have just a little bit of a lead here in this case by about a point. I would still say that really I would give the momentum at this point to Trump, largely because this is just really completely falling off and is no longer reflective of reality, in my opinion. Looking at all pollsters, you can really see going back the momentum. I think still is with Trump at this point. Now, I will say in terms of the individuals, just look at the two-way race. If we kind of Julian, we kick out, which I don't think is wise to do, the four-way, the multi-way components. Trump Harris. Trump is actually showing a significant lead here in this latest poll out of Atlas. Again, good sample size, and really that's kind of what we're seeing. If you were to go back with all of these polls, only one poll, and it is probably the most inaccurate of any of them at CNN, gives Harris a 1 point advantage. So I think that North Carolina is going to go in Trump's direction. And if we look back, historically speaking, what do we see? Do we see people breaking for Trump or breaking for Biden? You can see here the RCP average 47. People broke for Trump. They again, pretty pretty close in terms of the Biden numbers, anyways. 47, and he finished up at 48.7. So picked up a little bit between here and here, but then the majority of people broke for Trump in the end. So Trump was able to overcome any of the undecideds that broke for Biden, and actually end up not only beating him, but actually was able to win a majority of people in the state at 50%. So it wasn't even below the 50% threshold, even with the multi-way components that were present even in that election cycle. And if we go back even further to 2016, we can see in that situation what happened. The RCP average had Trump leading by only 3 percentage points boost for Trump on election day, or I should say whenever the polls ended up closing and all the votes were tallied. Meanwhile, Clinton only gained about 0.7 of a point. Johnson in that situation was able to garner about 2.7% of the votes. So Trump actually boosted his performance by an additional 2.7. And I'm not saying that necessarily is because the polls are just so biased or so wrong. It's just that whenever people go into the poll, into the voting booth, and they're actually making their decision, who are they going to vote for? All right, and we can look back previously at other polls. 2012, this situation, Romney was leading by 3. Ultimately, he ended up leading only by 2, but people still broke for him. So he still ended up adding to what he was, polling for. Now, so did Obama, just not as much. And we can go back 2008. Excuse me, that one's not found. All right, so we'll stop there. Going to Georgia, this is also the multi-candidate race. Filtering, same approach, just to see trajectory, tie, Trump. You tell me. I mean, looking at that data, and we can let's just see here. Okay, even CNN has it going from Harris to Trump with just the 2 polls, one back in August and then now in late October. And I think if we were to look at some of the other polls, we probably can see, yep, Quinnipiac 4, 6, 7. They're adding to Trump's likely victory here. In this one, you can really see where things are going in that direction. Really, where Trump is actually showing momentum going into the closing days of this election. So no matter how you look at it, at least in the 4-way race. Now, if we zoom in and look at just the 2-way race, how is that impacted right now? Well, you tell me. Again, every single poll in the last month, well, at least really and truthfully in the last 3 weeks, but going all the way back to early October, Trump, all the way through. Tie in one poll, and it's Marist poll. Nothing against them. I'm just saying it is the only pollster out of all of these. Now there are a couple of these which I might question. I might question this one. I would obviously question this one here. I think these are just maybe too good to be trues, honestly. So 2.6 likely spread. So electoral map. How are things shaping up right now? No toss-up map right now. Not much change from yesterday. 287 to 251. We create our own map based upon this. These obviously, as you know, I don't know why I did that. These, as you know, are still in the toss-up category. Now, additionally speaking, this is also turned competitive too, which is interesting because New Hampshire has not been a competitive race. historically, at least not for the Republicans. It has been something that the Republicans would love to be able to capture, obviously, just like with any of the states for that matter. But it's not one that really was even, I guess you could say, on the map for this year. New Mexico has turned a little bit competitive. I don't see this one going into the red column. I still see this one has ended up really, going towards the lean column at this point. And I do, this obviously we know these are lean. We know that. I do say that these are going to end up into Trump's column. We know that some of these races are indeed a lot closer than what we would like, but hey, they are what they are. Still see this one going towards Trump, and it's possible he could end up picking up, maybe these other states as well. And a lot of pollsters are essentially predicting something along those lines too, about a 312 to 200, and some odd votes for Harris, something maybe like a 312 to 226, which is entirely possible at this point. I know that these three states have traditionally voted as basically one block. I don't see where that's guaranteed though. There's everyone or multiple states vote as a block until they no longer do. Right? That's just the way it is. You can look back regionally at just about any of these elections, and you could basically make the argument, oh, these states always vote that way. Well, they always do until they don't. So that's important to understand. So it's entirely possible that there could be a split this year between these three. And I do predict that very well may be a possibility, although I still give the edge at this point to Trump. It's just I think the momentum's there. I believe that the most recent polls, again, looking at the four-way races especially, which are an issue. I mean, everyone wants to focus on the two ways as though that's all that's in play, but that's not reality. Now, granted, we don't know how people are going to break whenever the time comes, but traditionally speaking, the last two election cycles, Trump actually gained ground against where he was polling at on election day. Now, in some cases, his opponent did too, but they did not gain as much. All right, and that to me still cements the idea of the closet Trump voter, and they are a significant percentage of people. Granted, it's a small percentage, but in this election, it's going to be close. The important thing is, of course, that you like, share, and subscribe. No, the important thing is that you get out and vote. That's the important thing. By all means, if you don't have any plans on Tuesday, make a plan to go to the, if you haven't voted already, anyways, and get to the election booth and cast your vote. Obviously, I have my own preferences as far as that goes. But I still tell people to vote their conscience and to vote on policies. And I think that the distinction between the two of these candidates cannot be clear. I am going to record a second video. This has gone on a lot longer than I wanted to. But I'm going to record a second video where we basically kind of break down some of the things that are going on with the talking heads, some of the surrogates, definitely some interesting news, just stuff you can't make up, coming out of just, well, basically both areas, I guess you could say, both campaigns, really out of the Harris campaign, where things really have just, the wheels are falling off, I think, with some of their remarks. But we'll cover that in a second one. For now, we're going to leave you with again just a good word of advice, and that is to get to the voting booth, make your voice be heard, and to vote for the best direction that you think the country can go in.